The kingdom of Mitanni, controlling most of what is now northern Iraq and Syria, was at its height from around 1450 to 1350 BCE. At some point during this time, a Mitannian king wrote a letter to one of his vassals in the eastern part of the empire. It concerned a queen named Amaniah. He began the letter like this: "To Itia speak, so says the king. With regard to the district of Paharashe, which I previously gave to Queen Amaniah, now from its confines I have assigned a town to Ugi." There's a lot here, even in the first few lines. The first thing is that the king didn't waste time with any niceties. If he'd been writing to someone who was a great king like himself, he'd have begun the letter with a long formal inquiry into his ally's health and the health of his family and the welfare of his army and his country. And he'd have assured his brother king that he himself and his family, his army and his country were all well. But this letter was to a vassal, an inferior, so he could get right to the point. He didn't even give his own name, he was just the king. The second thing you might notice is that he had given a district known as Paharashe to someone, and he was now reassigning a town within that district to someone else. This practice of giving land to high officials is something that was common in this period. The great king could take the land away as easily as he had given it. And it wasn't just a field or two that he'd given, it was a whole region. We'll come back to this in a moment. A third point of interest is that the land had been given to a woman from the local royal family, Amaniah. As it happens, the letter was found in her house, so we know quite a bit about her. We'll come back to her as well. In the letter, the king goes on to say that he'd instructed an official to determine the new boundaries of the land held by Queen Amaniah and of the land given to the man named Ugi. And he wrote, "Ugi shall not encroach upon the territory of Amaniah, and Amaniah shall not encroach upon the boundary of Ugi. Indeed, no one shall encroach upon the boundary of Amaniah." So although he was taking land away from the queen, it was a very specific amount of land with defined borders, and the remaining property continued to be hers. The letter ends with a notice of how Amaniah would be compensated for the loss of her land to the man named Ugi. The king wrote that he had told another local official, "Your own town I have assigned to the district of Amaniah." So she would still have control of the same number of towns. The king was just switching one for another. The letter was sealed with the cylinder seal of Saushtatar, king of Mitanni. So you might think that the letter was sent by King Saushtatar. This is what the first translator of the letter believed, with good reason. Unfortunately, though, we now know that several later kings, who were descendants of Saushtatar, impressed their ancestors' seal on their own documents. So this letter could actually be from any of them. Saushtatar seems to have been seen as the founder of the empire. So his seal became the dynastic seal for his successors. That means we don't know which king sent the letter, but the seal assures us that it was definitely one of the great kings of Mitanni. So let's look at Queen Amaniah. The local king who received this letter must have given it to her for her records, since it pertained to lands that she controlled. Amaniah lived in a kingdom called Arapha, in the eastern part of the Mitanni kingdom. Its capital city lies under the modern city of Kirkuk, so it hasn't been and it can't be excavated. Arapha was closer to Ashur than to the heart of Mitanni. Later, it would be part of the kingdom of Assyria. But during this period, the late 15th and early 14th century BCE, Assyria was subject to the Mitannian Empire. King Saushtatar had probably been responsible for conquering the region. A later inscription records that he stole a door of silver and gold from the land of Assyria and took it back to his palace. Queen Amaniah apparently didn't live in the capital city of Arapha, at least not all the time. She had a house in the small nearby town of Nuzi, which was home to about 1,600 people. Archaeologists excavated Nuzi from 1925 to 1931, and they uncovered about 5,000 cuneiform tablets. These have provided us with wonderful details about this era. Amaniah's home was impressive. It was a villa extending over 1,200 square meters, or almost 13,000 square feet, with 35 rooms. Beautifully decorated, it had tiled floors and fashionable wall paintings that showed the influence of Egyptian and Aegean art. Amaniah lived there with her son, Crown Prince Shilwa-Teshub, and his family. Shilwa-Teshub was in line for the throne of Arapa. In time, he would become the vassal of the Mitannian king. When the house was excavated, archaeologists uncovered about 730 cuneiform tablets there, recording the business affairs of Prince Shilwa-Teshub, his 8 wives, and his mother. Amaniah's archives show that the land she received from the Mitannian king was just one of 6 large estates that she owned. Quite a few of the tablets listed rations provided by Prince Shilwa-Teshub to every member of his household, including his mother, his wives, and the dozens of servants, hired men, and slaves who helped run the estate. It's surprising in a way that Amaniah would need to be provided with food and clothing from her son's household budget, since she was such a powerful landowner herself. But she was given much more than she needed for her own maintenance. Perhaps she used these goods to provide for her own servants. Meanwhile, the family archive shows that her son made loans to people in the town. As one of the richest men there, he had grain, silver, and wood to spare, and his loans were provided free of interest to people in need. This sounds generous, but we can see from his records that he still foreclosed on people who couldn't pay him back. The situation in the kingdom of Arapa was somewhat typical for the Mitannian Empire. It was a relatively peaceful era, so there are few records in Nuzi of any military activity. The Mitannian king had many vassals who paid him tribute, like the king of Arapa. The vassals in turn taxed their subjects in order to provide for their own needs and to come up with the wealth for their tribute payments. But aside from demanding tribute and giving land to important people, the king of Mitanni seems mostly to have left Arapa alone. Besides the letter about Amaniah's land, almost no records from Nuzi mention the great king at all. The people there were preoccupied with local matters. And Arapa was a wealthy kingdom. Even the mayor of Nuzi had an opulent palace with more than 100 rooms. His toilets had marble seats, and some of the private rooms had marble floors. Archaeologists have noticed that there was a significant divide between rich and poor in Nuzi, and in some of the other vassal kingdoms of Mitanni. Vast houses like the one owned by Shilwa-Teshub shared neighborhoods with the much smaller dwellings of the poor. But not all of Mitanni's small kingdoms were like this. Some cities were not dominated by palaces, and in those cities there was less of a divide between rich and poor. The houses are much more similar to one another in size. Several sites near the Euphrates in Syria are like this. One of the best known of these is called Amar. In towns like Amar, a group of local men called the elders played a big role in running things and overseeing legal issues that arose. Local kings existed, but they weren't very powerful. Let's go back to that land that the Mitannian king had given to Amaniah. We have records of a lot of royal land grants in this era, and not just in Mitanni. Back in the Old Babylonian period, between about 1900 and 1595 BCE, kings had provided some of their officials and soldiers with fields so that they could support their families. But during the following era, the Late Bronze Age, royal gifts of land to officials got very much bigger, including whole towns and the lands around them. Most of these landholdings were much larger than any one household would need. The stage between these two extremes can be seen in some of the documents from the Kingdom of Hana in eastern Syria. In the period between about 1600 and 1450 BCE, before the time of Amaniah's archive, quite a few contracts have been found in Hana that record royal grants of land. Some of these are for many fields, but some are just for a small property, a single house in one case. There were a number of clauses to these land grant contracts. They started with the description of the land itself, its size, where it was located, and who owned the lands around it. It's interesting to note that the land around the fields being given by the king is often described as belonging to the palace. So the kings seem to have been claiming control of more and more of the land in the kingdom. It was probably less possible than before for private individuals to buy and sell property. The next clause noted who owned the land. In a private sale, this is where you would find the name of the seller. But in the land grants, the current owner was the king. But he wasn't the sole owner. The scribe listed the king and a number of local gods as the owners. It seems that the land wasn't just perceived as royal, but as shared with the gods. Then there was an oath sworn in the names of these same gods. Strangely enough, this was followed by a threat of punishment on anyone who broke the contract. These types of punishments were almost always found on contracts for the sale of land in the Hana kingdom. If someone went back on their word, hot asphalt would be smeared on their head. This protected the buyer from the seller denying the legality of their transaction. But who would go back on a land grant? The person receiving the land presumably would have had no reason to contest it. And if the king changed his mind, would officials smear hot asphalt on his head? Certainly not. So the clause probably referred to some previous owner who might claim that the land was actually his. The list of witnesses came next, and these were almost all high officials, often with the king's son as the first witness. One final detail is that the Hana kings always sealed the land grant contracts with their elaborate royal cylinder seals. That means the kings probably were physically there when the contract was drawn up. So the awarding of these land grants might have been accompanied by some sort of ceremony with some of the most important people in the kingdom present, including the king. Starting around 1500 BCE, kings from several other kingdoms adopted this same idea of granting extensive lands to important civil servants and religious leaders. We find grants like this in Hatti and Mitanni and in Babylonia as well. So, for example, there's a tablet from the reign of Saushtatar that records a gift of land in a place called Basiru. And there are several later Mitannian and Hittite tablets of the same kind. Like the earlier Hana kingdom texts, they almost all bear the king's seal. Sometimes it was the great king who was awarding the land. Sometimes it was a local vassal king. The original gift from the Mitannian king to Queen Amaniah probably was recorded in a contract like this, impressed with the king's seal. We don't have that one, but the change in the borders of the lands that she was given came in the form of a letter, and again it was sealed. In Kassite Babylonia, a similar phenomenon was taking place, but most of the records are found not on clay tablets, but on stone stelas. These were set up in temples, recording land gifts from the king. They're known as kudurus, and they were an innovation of this era in Babylonia. Like the land grants from Hana, Hatti, and Mitanni, they include a description of the land gift, and they note that it's from the king. And they give the name of the man who received it. As with the gift to Amaniah, each recipient received a huge amount of land, probably a whole village with its surrounding fields. The kudurus don't list the witnesses or the date, but they add a new feature, a curse on anyone who would change the agreement. The obvious person who might go back on his word was the king. But the king couldn't be held to account by any mortal person. The kudurus seem to have been set up by the recipients, who were often priests, and who were appealing to the gods to hold the king accountable if he took back the land that he'd provided to them. Some scholars have described this widespread institution of royal land grants as something like a feudal system. The king gave out large estates to his officials and expected their loyalty in return. The officials benefited from the income from the land, but they also were expected to take responsibility for collecting taxes on their estates. But European feudalism was different from this in many ways. The contracts and kudurus recording late Bronze Age land grants don't usually list what was required of the recipients, and the military side of later medieval feudalism doesn't seem to be present at all. But the system seems to have been an effective way of maintaining control of the lands under Mitannian, Babylonian, and Hittite control. I mentioned that in the town of Nuzi, you'd hardly guess that the Mitannian kings ruled the area. Their names are so rarely found on the tablets. But in some other regions at this time, the kings seem to have been surprisingly active in a number of aspects of their subjects' lives. In the western part of Mitanni and in Hatti, a whole bunch of different types of transactions are described as having taken place in the presence of the king, and many of them had his seal impressed on the tablet. Now, some of the events at which the king was present were as important as the awarding of land grants. Things like the creation of important treaties or legal decisions by the king. You can absolutely understand why the king would have been present for these and why he would have impressed his seal on the documents that were produced. But some of the things that happened in the presence of the king were just common everyday transactions. Someone bought a bull. Someone else bought a slave. A slave was freed by his owner. A woman gave a vineyard and some olives to another woman. All of these took place in the presence of the king. Why did the king need to be there for these everyday occurrences? There's a whole category of tablets that were impressed with the king's seal, and it seems to have been the same seal. So, for example, impressions of the seal of Saushatar have been found not only on Amaniah's letter from Nuzi in the far east of the empire, but also on tablets from Tel Brak in the center of the empire, and on others from the sites of Tel Bazi and El Mara in the northwest. These sites were hundreds of miles apart. So, why was this true? Why and how did the king's seal get to be on so many different types of tablets in so many distant places? Were the kings of Mitanni in the habit of traveling all around their kingdom, hearing legal cases, and being present for purchases that people made? Or did men and women come to the capital city, get an appointment to be in the presence of the king for the writing of their contracts, and then take the sealed tablets home with them? It could be that both of these things happened. As for why, it may have had something to do with the king's visibility. Today, we don't need to get physically close to our political leaders in order to feel that they have a lot of power over our lives. We see them and we hear about pretty much every detail of what they do. We can't avoid them even if we try. They're all over the internet, in every newspaper and magazine, on TV, in talk shows, and on cable news 24/7. But in the world before mass media, the king wasn't omnipresent at all. The Hellenistic Greeks and the Romans used coins with images of the ruler's face on them as propaganda. Coins were useful reminders of who was in charge, because absolutely everybody used them to pay for things. Eventually, the leaders even put a second image on the back to commemorate some great victory or achievement. But for our late Bronze Age kings, coins were a long way off in the future. People still weighed out silver on a scale when they paid for things. So how did the king keep his name in people's minds? How did he remind his people of who he was and what he'd done? If particular legal contracts needed the king's presence, well, that reminded you about him, and maybe even got you into the same room with him. But could the king really have been there so often for so many minor legal procedures? It would have been very time-consuming. The kings had their kingdoms to run. Perhaps the actual king didn't need to be present at all for some of these transactions. Maybe an official seal bearer was allowed to roll the king's seal on some of these tablets for him. It could even be that a statue of the king could have served in place of the king himself. There's no certain evidence for this, but since everyone believed that statues had their own life force, and that some part of the king was captured in his statue, this might have been a good solution to the need for the king to be in many places at once. Royal statues certainly stood in for the king in several other situations, like when oaths were sworn in his name, and they reminded the populace of how important he was. In these various ways, the kings of Mitanni seem to have been able to control their realms without necessarily resorting to force. The power of vassals to break away from the king was limited by the fact that the great king directly owned some of the lands within their realms, and he could give those lands to whomever he chose. Queen Amaniah, for example, probably felt an allegiance to the king of Mitanni because of the lands he'd awarded to her, as well as an allegiance to her husband, the vassal king of Arapa. The increased engagement of the king with intricate details of the lives of his subjects might also have convinced them of his legitimate right to rule over them. After all, like rulers in any period of ancient Near Eastern history, the kings of the Late Bronze Age needed to be sure that soldiers and laborers would appear when they were drafted, and that people would pay their taxes. If the king was someone who lived far away in a capital city you'd never visited, he had to find ways to remind you of his power and of your role as his subject. So if he gave land to someone you knew, or if his seal was needed on a contract you had to draw up, or if he sometimes visited your city to hear legal cases, or if his statue was there in your town needing offerings, then he was a real presence in your life. He was someone for whom you might be willing to work or to fight. The Late Bronze Age seems, as a result, to have been an era of peace and prosperity, not just between the great kings, but also within their kingdoms. Mitanni thrived for more than 150 years, but towards the middle of the 14th century, things started to go downhill. We get a glimpse of this in the correspondence of King Tushratta of Mitanni with the kings of Egypt. Tushratta's daughter, Tadduhepa, had married the pharaoh Amenhotep III, and at that time, he'd asked a favor of his Egyptian ally. He wanted a gold statue of Tadduhepa. This request for a statue of his daughter had a precedent. When Amenhotep III had married a Babylonian princess, he'd sent a statue of that princess to her father, the king of Babylon. Perhaps the statue could serve as a physical confirmation of the marriage relationship between the two kings. That's what Tushratta implied when he'd first written to Amenhotep about this. He quoted what he thought other people would say about the statue of his daughter once it arrived. He wrote that, "Before earth and before the heavens are the words spoken, this gold image is Tadduhepa, the daughter of Tushratta, the lord of Mitanni, whom he gave as wife of Amenhotep, the lord of Egypt. And Amenhotep made a molten gold image and full of love dispatched it to Tushratta." People would, according to him, see the statues as confirming the alliance and love between himself and the pharaoh. Later, Tushratta added to the request. Now he wanted a statue of himself, as well as one of his daughter Tadduhepa. This obviously couldn't have been a real likeness, since Tushratta had never traveled to Egypt, and none of the Egyptian artisans would ever have seen him. But that wasn't a concern. Statues weren't intended to look like the person they depicted. They were idealized. Tushratta was also now more specific. He said the statue should be, in his words, of solid cast gold, one of myself, and a second statue, a statue of Tadduhepa, my daughter. Solid cast gold? That was quite a request. Amenhotep III wrote back, "Don't talk of giving statues just of solid cast gold. I will give you ones made also of lapis lazuli." Lapis lazuli is a deep blue stone that was greatly prized by the ancient peoples. You can imagine that Tushratta must have been thrilled. We know from royal letters found in the late 19th century in Amarna in Egypt that Amenhotep III had the statues made. Not only that, he made sure that the Mitannian diplomatic corps saw them and could attest to their existence. But the pharaoh didn't get around to sending them before he died. At the time of his death, Amenhotep III had been married to Tadduhepa for only 2 years. His son Akhenaten inherited the throne, and some of his father's wives. Akhenaten married Taduhepa, which meant that Tushratta was still the father-in-law of the king of Egypt. King Tushratta hoped that their relationship would be just as close as the bond he'd had with Akhenaten's father. He expressed this repeatedly in his letters. But Akhenaten turned out not to be a reliable ally or correspondent. For Tushratta, the big change in their relationship was all wrapped up with the issue of the gold statues. Akhenaten simply didn't send them. The gift that was eventually transmitted was something less than the Mitannian king had been anticipating. Tushratta described what happened. He said, "My brother," that's Akhenaten, "sent me statues made of wood." They were gold-plated, but they weren't the solid gold statues he'd been promised. He wrote to Egypt over and over after this to complain about how he'd been snubbed. He even wrote to Akhenaten's mother, Tia, asking her to put in a word with her son to convince him to send the gold statues. The failure to send a gift might sound trivial to us, but so much of the alliances between the great kings of this era took the form of reciprocal gift-giving. Tushratta was obsessed with Akhenaten's failure to send the statues, not just because he wanted more gold, but because he clearly felt himself to be slipping out of Egyptian favor. He depended on his alliances, and the physical proof of them was seen in the regular exchange of letters, gifts, and messengers. As far as we know, the gold statues never arrived, and Mitanni's relationship with Egypt never returned to the warm friendship Tushratta had shared with Amenhotep III. Pharaoh Akhenaten was no longer interested in maintaining close ties with Mitanni. Meanwhile, the Hittites were gaining in power and becoming more aggressive, and they had never been friendly with Mitanni, even at the best of times. You can imagine that Tushratta was getting worried, and he was right to. Mitanni's days as a great power were almost over.